Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Beasts of the Old World, where today we're going to have a look at something that, whilst it certainly does meet the definition of beast, is a far cry from the other critters that we've seen in this series so far, namely the great eagles. Now, immediately, you might be thinking that this is a reference to something, and you would be absolutely correct. Even to the point where the great eagles were considered to be messengers of the Old Ones, much like their Lord of the Rings counterparts. Yet further similarities exist as well, but we'll leave those to be discovered as they come around naturally. So, first and foremost, what is a great eagle? Well, that's not a difficult question to answer, as it is, of course, an enormous, eagle-like creature. I draw a distinction between the two because a regular eagle is as a hummingbird to these enormous monsters. To put it into a bit of scale here, the largest eagle ever recorded in our own history had a wingspan of about 9 to 10 feet, or 3 odd meters. The great eagles have a wingspan of 30 feet, or in excess of 9 meters. And their wings are far from the only thing that's been gigantified on these avian behemoths. Their talons too, the length, sharpness, and toughness of spear tips. Their beaks like halberds blades, except a lot quicker, and some would say a lot sharper as well. Great eagles have been described as able to snip off a man's arm before the soldier can even react to what's happening. And it's probably a good thing that the eagles have such incredible speed and reflexes as well, as their preferred strategy is diving down on a target at terminal velocity from hundreds, if not thousands, of feet, and then swooping up at the last absolute instance to grab their targets in the talons and then shoot right back up into the sky again. A flap or two, and the great eagle is already at hundreds of feet. Now, if the target is prey, as in food, it'll simply carry it back home to its nest, or kill it with its claws. If the target is something less cooperative and actively hostile, like, say, for example, a dwarf that got a little bit too close to Athelloren, then the optimal solution is often simply to release, and allow gravity to take care of the rest. Now, a dwarf might seem like an unlikely foe, however. I mean, they're great eagles, right? They're on the side of law, justice, order, and all of that. Well, in Lord of the Rings, maybe, but this ain't Lord of the Rings. They might look the same, but the great eagles of the Warhammer world most assuredly are not friends of the Dowie. In fact, they can be remarkably partisan. Because far from being mere bird brains, you see, the great eagles are actually incredibly intelligent. And with elevated intelligence evidently comes racism. Don't look at me like that. It's true. The great birds love elves, and they can tolerate certain fractions of humanity here and there on occasion, but they absolutely loathe dwarves of all types, and greenskins. In fact, they might even hate the greenskins a little bit more than the Dowie. This has to do with the fact that the great eagles are extraordinarily long-lived, and apparently, ironically I suppose, have their own little version of the Book of Grudges. You see, great eagles remember their friends for a very long time, and seemingly pass down this friendship throughout the generations, to the point that the great eagles that dwell on Ulthuan, for example, will actively scout for the High Elves, for invading Dark Elves or marauding raider fleets or anything else, and then fly back to Ulthuan and warn the Elves. Not because they're in any sort of master-servant relationship, mind you. The Great Eagles are not the servants of the Elves. They are not their scouts due to the fact that that is their job or anything. They simply choose to do this out of their own volition. Even on the handful of occasions where a Great Eagle allows an elven rider to be borne into battle atop the bird's majestic shoulders, this is an agreement amongst equals, and not the relationship between a mount and a rider. This relationship also exists in the forest of Athaloran. Those elves, of course, fled into the forest during the War of Vengeance, or the War of the Beard, again, depending upon whom you ask. During that particular conflict, incidentally, the Great Eagles had already developed a long-lasting bond with the Elves, and so when a portion of their populace fled into the forest of Athaloran, the Great Eagles simply settled in the largest and tallest of trees, or, more commonly, in the World's Edge Mountains, at the very peak of the mountaintops, where even the dwarves very rarely tread. And if they do, well, a fat little clumsy thing trying to climb a mountain is very, very easy prey for an enormous bird of prey, as it turns out. These Great Eagles of the Old World fulfill in many ways the same role as those of Ulthuan. They fly across the stretches between the World's Edge Mountains and Athaloran. They patrol the routes to the forest, and whenever they see anyone sneaking along, be they dwarves or orcs or occasionally darker, fouler things still, Athaloran has been invaded by quite a lot of mischief over the years, including a necromancer horde that very nearly was the end of the forest, but deviating a bit from the point here, then the Great Eagles will warn the Denzians of the forest, and quite frequently they'll try to deal with the intruders themselves as well, partially because of their bond to the Elves, as aforementioned, but also in large part because they personally really hate a lot of the creatures tramping through their territories. And hate is often supplemented with a healthy appetite as well. As dwarves, you see, once you've peeled off all of that annoying armor, nice, fatty, seasoned flesh, just a taste of beer, you see. This might sound cruel and inhumane, but, well, one, they're giant birds. They don't really care about inhumanities. And secondly, the sentiment is returned 100% by the dwarves themselves, who also equally loathe and hate the Great Eagles. Once again, the two species actually share a remarkable number of similarities. They both hate greenskins, they both hold grudges for actually forever, and they like to tie themselves to never-ending oaths of allegiance and friendship with lesser species. You really would think they'd be the fastest of friends, were it not for the fact that both of them are so unimaginably stubborn. And indeed, there have been dwarves that have gone to extraordinary lengths to take down and pluck a particular feathered fiend. And those dwarves can indeed attest to the fact that when you manage to down one of the Great Eagles, they do make for delectable eating. Not to mention the generous portions, of course. And thus the wheel of hatred turns yet again, as the family of the giant eagle will want to hunt down the dwarf and eat him in return. That dwarf's family will then shake their fist at the sky and go, "You damn monsters!" and hunt one of them down. And thus the wheel of everlasting dinner continues to turn. And whilst we're on the topic of intelligent species devouring one another for no other reason than because they're tasty, this is also in part the rationale behind the whole hating greenskins things. Now, in this case, it's not because the eagles find the greenskins particularly delectable, and in fact they find them absolutely goddamn disgusting, and will prefer to either drop them from great heights, slash them apart with their claws, or, when absolutely necessary, peck them apart, rather than, nom on them like they do the dwarves. This sentiment, however, is not, in this case, returned by the greenskins. Goblins in particular find Great Eagle's eggs to be the finest of delicacies. And if the goblins like something, the orcs are going to find it triply valuable. There have even been the occasional misguided attempts amongst greenskins and orcs to try and tame great eagles. This has not worked out one single solitary time. Not ever, which speaks to both sides' determination that the one keeps trying and the other keeps making sure they fail in some way or another, usually with violence. But before you begin to despair about all of this hostility, there are other factions that the Great Eagles are on a decent enough footing with, other than elves, and whom they do not consider automatically to be a quick snack and a meal. These are humans, though it can vary greatly. The Great Eagles, for example, are reasonably fond of the Bretonnians, not to the point of offering them outward obvious aid, unlike the elves, but they don't dislike them, and they will only snack upon them in the most pressing of circumstances. Indeed, they will even go a little bit out of their way to help them should they happen across a situation in which a Bretonnian might be in trouble. There are examples of them aiding villages, or travelling lords and knights, and even delving into battle against hated foes of raiders, greenskins, or beastmen. Now, whether or not they do this to aid the Bretonnians, or simply because they really hate the opposition, is somewhat unclear. But on every occasion where the Bretonnians have shown some sign of gratitude towards the eagle, it has always reciprocated it by acknowledging it before leaving. And again, the eagles absolutely do understand, or, well, allow me to expand upon this point ever so slightly. The eagles are plenty intelligent enough to understand human and elf behavior. Some of them are even clever enough to understand our words, and a very small percentage have even managed to figure out how to speak in elven or human tongues. A remarkable feat, no doubt about it. But the issue here is, sort of a language barrier? Well, not really a language barrier, more of a cultural barrier. For you see, a enormous bird and a human oddly enough, see the world slightly differently. From the bird's perspective, we are pitiful little weird featherless creatures who crawl around on the ground all day in the muck and mud, striving to make ends meet, growing things and hunting only rarely. We appear bound to the land, to feudal lords, to all kinds of weird and arbitrary seeming systems. We are sad creatures, upon whom they occasionally take pittance, and they help us out a little bit. Now, they do have a loose understanding of the hierarchy of humanity, like they'd be able to understand the difference between a knight and a squire, for example, but if you tell them to differentiate between, one empire bureaucrat to another, they probably wouldn't understand, nor would they frankly bother to understand either. From the human perspective, the great eagles are viewed both as enormously dangerous predators, and on occasion as pests as well. Here's the thing, one of the things that the eagles don't understand is property laws. And sometimes, therefore, when they see an enormous cow grazing in the meadow, or a herd of sheep, for example, they see prey animals, whereas the rest of us might see property. You can see how this might lead to a conflict or two. Now, even the great eagles themselves, after extended exposure to this idea, will eventually realize that, okay, the weird humans consider that to be theirs, fine. I guess I'll stay away from it unless I'm particularly peckish. Then I'll grab them. Not so much because they're afraid of the humans, because, well, dwarves are rarely a threat, humans are practically never a threat, but more because they too, again, understand exactly what they're doing to at least a certain degree. Meanwhile, humanity has a nasty habit of anthropomorphizing the birds and trying to enforce their own standards upon them. The Bretonnians, for example, view the great eagles as incredibly noble beings, as protectors of all that is good and honest, and thus, in turn, obviously, protectors of Bretonnia. The birds would disagree on that particular point, but hey, they're not going to attack the Bretonnians, usually, so the misunderstanding works itself out fairly well. In the Empire, meanwhile, they're primarily seen as incredibly dangerous predators, very territorial predators that can be reasoned with to a degree, e.g., bribed, for example, by feeding them some livestock here and there. There have even been occasions where this has turned a great eagle into a bit of a protector for a village, rare though that might be, as that requires again the building of a bit of a bond. And great eagles, once more, don't really have a concept of, well, villages, necessarily. They understand it more in terms of factions and/or individuals. They see elves, for example, as one large amorphous entity. They probably do understand that there are some differences here and there between wood elves and high elves, and they definitely understand there's a difference between high elves and dark elves, but one human to another, they probably aren't going to give too much of a shit. Unless, again, the human gives them a good reason to actually care. In all due honesty, however, the majority of seemingly kind-hearted interventions on behalf of the Great Eagles is more because of their unending, unflinching, ever-burning, fierce hatred of certain races. Greenskins again, in particular. I'm sure they're not particularly fond of Skaven either, but as they spend the majority of their time underground, they probably haven't developed quite the same feeling of distaste for them. Great eagles are also not, incidentally, particularly fond of chaos. They don't go out of their way to hunt them down in quite the same way that they do orcs, but they do understand that beastmen, they are a far greater threat to them than merely roaming bands of orcs. The orc is despicable because, well, it is an asshole, and it tries to eat them on frequent occasions. A pretty damn good reason for enmity there. But stuff like beastmen and outright chaos warriors or agents of chaos, oof, that's not a question of being eaten. That is a question of the entire world being destroyed. As perhaps the single earliest instance, in actually recorded history anyways, elven myth would tell you otherwise, of the Great Eagles actively lending assistance to another faction was during the Great War against Chaos. The first one, you know, when the entire world basically exploded and the elves barely managed to hold off the eternal waves of demonic monsters. At which point the Great Eagles themselves would have been first and foremost messengers of the Old Ones rather than, you know, being friends of the Elves. The knowledge of what chaos is, however, has remained strong within their ranks throughout the millennia. And when it comes to fighting chaos, the Great Eagles are near uniquely well equipped. For you see, they possess an innate ability, a natural superpower, one might even say, that has tickled the pickles of many learned men all across the old world. Namely, that the Great Eagles appear to be not merely resistant to chaos, but 100% immune to chaos, as not at any point in the entirety of recorded history, either that of man or dwarf or elf, has there been a single solitary instance of a corrupted great eagle. There are very, very few species, if damn near any, in fact, in the Warhammer world that can claim that achievement. Now, if the Great Eagles themselves could only, you know, begin to organize a little bit and push back actively, they might be one of the forces of Order's finest weapons against the Chaos Hordes. But, once again, the Eagles' understanding of things like borders and stuff is hazy. So unless the Chaos Hordes are going to be showing up near their eyries, at which point it probably would be pretty much over already, they are unlikely to care over much about, I don't know, a storm of chaos descending from the north. Less than optimal, but you gotta deal with what you've gotta deal with. And at least a few of them are likely to head northwards if they're asked very prettily by their elven friends, so take it or leave it, I do suppose. And on the battlefield, Great Eagles can be very dangerous indeed. Now, the bird in and of itself is lethal enough for being, you know, a 9-meter wingspan bird. That alone is not exactly a small threat, and coming diving out of the skies at God Emperor only knows how many hundreds of kilometers per hour, it's going to impact a formation of warriors like a meteor made out of claws and beaks. that's going to do a hell of a lot of damage. And a regular human being is going to have a very hard time dealing with a creature like this. But of course, in the Warhammer world, there are a lot of things that are even bigger and even badder than a great eagle, and a lot of them dwell in the far north. A great eagle is going to have a hard time dealing with, a dragon, or a manticore, or many of the other monsters that dwell up there. And whilst its natural weapons, claws and beaks, are sharp, viciously so, they are not unnaturally so. They are mere animals, and they were not originally designed for combat by their masters, the old ones. Thus, they're gonna have a hard time with stuff like plate armor, for example. This is one of the reasons why getting the armor off those dastardly little dwarves often proves so damn difficult. To really truly shine in organized large-scale combat, therefore, the Great Eagle is going to need a rider. Now, a pack of Great Eagles will be devastating, but at the end of the day, they are merely intelligent animals. They don't wear any protection themselves, they have no real finesseful understandings of the art of combat, and they don't have much in the way of overt strategy or tactics that they can rely upon. They are predators rather than soldiers, warriors, or fighters. A rider, however, can provide these things that the Great Eagle itself does not have. A rider can give information to the bird, such things as, okay, swoop down over there, they're going to be unlikely to be able to react, or there's a soft target. Conversely, we seem to be surrounded by heavy cornate knights. Perhaps it is time to fly really quickly. Or, don't dive on that unit right there. That's a formation of Chaos Dwarf blunderbusters, and they will pepper a birded behind with significant conviction. Riders also bring with them weaponry, from the extraordinarily useful to the... why... You've probably seen, for example, elves using spears on the back of eagles. Now, it's not quite as ridiculous as using a spear on the back of a dragon, mind you, but it seems somewhat idiotic. Oh, what are you going to do? Well, I have a pokey stick. Oh, you're going to use that on the back of a bucking, rampaging, jumping, flying beast, are you? Well, I hope your aim is really good, and I hope you're very good at steadying yourself, because you're going to need all of those things. I suppose it's better than a sword, which some people have used as well. But if you really want to help out your feathered friend, then magic. Magic will be a great option, since that would allow the Great Eagle to use its primary armament, its mobility, first and foremost, rather than its claws, which, again, whilst dangerous, is dangerous to prey. It is dangerous to warbands and skirmishing groups of greenskins wearing fur. It is significantly less dangerous to a solid block of Nurgle warriors. You throw a fireball into the midst of that conflagration of flatulence, however, now that'll work out quite well. And even if you're not magically inclined, a bow will work out very well too. The Wood Elves Glade Lords, for example, those lucky enough to have created a bond with Great Eagles, will frequently use bows. And the additional power of the velocity of the bird swooping down, combined with the elevation advantage, means that these bows do not fire like regular bows. No twinky-tranky here, more like a ballista being fired, sending out an arrow at ridiculous speeds capable of hammering through multiple ranks of enemies. And beyond the obvious opportunities for bloodshed, we also should not ignore the clear-as-the-sky itself opportunities for advanced reconnaissance, because, you know, flying is pretty useful when it comes to finding out where your enemies are and what they're doing. And since the Great Eagles can fly at an altitude well beyond the range of pretty much any normal weapon in the Warhammer world, you can simply just keep hovering over them all the livelong day, reporting back to your side precisely where they're going. Unless, of course, they've got flyers of their own, in which case, welcome to World War II, Dogfighting Edition. I would also absolutely love to try and introduce some logistical angle to this as well, but honestly, great eagles, logistically speaking, are probably going to be primarily a problem, due to the fact that they eat a lot and they might get into heated arguments, read whole roast, with certain elements of one's allies. They also, yet again, as we mentioned previously, have a bit of a hard time understanding the concept of property and sharing. So even if they do manage to kill some prey, they're probably just going to eat it and then leave the leftovers. They might share with their rider if they're particularly fond of him, but even that's going to require a little bit of persuading and perhaps some good petting action. Petting action. You know what? I think it's time to end the video right there, before we get into more uncomfortable territory. After all, there is a question about how they... Never mind. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.